Thank you for joining today's Morning Minute Meditation. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse number 7 says, "But the end of all things is at hand. Be ye therefore sober and watch unto prayer." What does Peter mean when he says the end of all things? What's he referring to? How can we interpret this? I think we can interpret it very literally, personally speaking. Understanding Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27 tells us that every man has an appointment with death. And over again, the scriptures remind us of the eventuality of death. The obituaries remind us of the eventuality of death. Graveyards remind us of the eventualities of death. Death is a sure event. It's a fact of life. You go all the way back to Genesis chapter number 5, and that list in the lineage of Adam, whether they lived 969 years or less, no matter how long they lived, they died. Of course, everyone except Enoch and Elijah died, and they are a picture of the rapture of the church. And so we're reminded every day of our lives that the end of all things is near, personally speaking. I believe we can say that the end of all things, as Peter said it, was near, very literally, politically speaking, because a few years after Peter wrote this, Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. And so his entire way of life and their nation was destroyed. Now, I'm not going to stay on this soapbox very long. It just seems like the end of all things is near, politically speaking. A nation more interested in being politically correct than scripturally correct. Politicians bent, on both sides of the aisle, by the way, bent on destroying the Constitution and demolishing our way of life. If God doesn't intervene, our country is going to be destroyed from the inside out. And I think we can interpret this very literally, prophetically speaking. Let's not forget the words of John in the book of the Revelation in chapter 21. Verse number 4, he said, "The former things are passed away." And those former things being death and sorrow and crying and pain. Hallelujah. Jesus is coming, just like he said, and he's taking us, the church, out of all this mess. And when he does, only a few short years later, the former things will then be passed away. So, anyway, with all that said, the end of all things is near, personally speaking. We're all going to die. Seems like the end of all things is near, politically speaking. I don't know if our nation can recover or not. God's still on the throne, though. The end of all things is near, prophetically speaking. Jesus is coming any day now. And so if we believe the end of all things is near, how should we as Christians behave? The first thing that Peter said, after he said the end of all things is near, he said, "Be ye therefore sober." The word sober in Strong's Concordance means to be of a sound mind, sane, moderate, or be in your right mind. First and foremost, the end of all things is near. All right, what do? Well, don't get caught up in the hysteria or get bent out of shape. Death is a natural part of life. Don't get bent out of shape over it. God's in control no matter what happens in our country. Don't lose your mind. Jesus is coming, and that'll solve every problem you or I have. So stay sane. What's the lesson for us to learn here? Stop losing your mind. Stop listening to the news media and their propaganda if it keeps you from being sober. Stop worrying about things you can't control if it keeps you from being sane. Stop pondering faithlessly about this temporal world and start preparing fervently for the world to come. The end of all things is near. Well, is that necessarily a bad thing? I just want to encourage you from instruction from Peter regarding the end of all things to stop losing your mind. It's going to be all right.